Hello and welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our writers, Ragan Sutterfield, who has written a cover story for our December issue, Microbes in the Manger. We are going to be talking about that article and microbiology. And before we dive into those topics, welcome, Reagan. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me here, John. So, I am an Episcopal priest. I'm associate rector at Christ Episcopal Church here in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I am also an avid naturalist and birder. I've got a background in studying birds and ornithology, but also some background in farming. And so that's part of what got me interested in the topics around this article of just understanding the biology that is all around us and influencing who we are and how we live.
That's great. Well, this fascinating article, throughout it from start to finish, there is talk of science, microbes, human microbiomes, and some of this stuff is becoming pretty well known and pretty popular. The gut microbiome is kind of trendy. But for those readers and listeners out there who are very unfamiliar with this, could you give us just a really, hopefully just simple, as simple as possible kind of intro to some of these scientific ideas in the article?
Sure. In the simplest way, the microbiome is all that life that is microscopic. And more than half the mass of living things on Earth are microscopic organisms. And those include things like bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes. So there are all these very, very small things that are moving around and working in the soil and our bodies around plants. And some of them are pathogens. And so a lot of us know them through antibiotics, but most of them, at least in our bodies, are actually helping us live and thrive. And we wouldn't be who we are or able to live a healthy life without them.
Very cool. Thank you. And so in the article, you were talking about how um, at the moment of Christ's birth, in the days and hours and weeks and months after his birth, he's receiving microbes from the people and other living things around him. And you say in the article, um, we might easily say that microbes were the first members of the body of Christ. I wonder if you could just dive a little more into that idea with us and tell us what you think might be the theological significance of having that perspective.
Sure. So I want to really take the incarnation seriously. So if Christ becomes fully incarnate as a human being, then we have to ask the question of what does it mean to be human? And the reality is that if we were to take all the living cells that are present in this person, then a huge number of them are not genetically the same as me, Ragan Sutterfield. A lot of them belong to bacteria and fungi and other kinds of things. And that had to be true for Jesus Christ as well. If Christ was fully human, then this was true of him as well. And so what does that mean? It means that there are other creatures than just the human that were part of this incarnational process. And so I wanted to explore that and particularly think along this kind of Franciscan vein, because the Franciscans have always been really good at thinking imaginatively about what the incarnation means, and to think about this kind of radicalization of the manger scene and all of the creatures that were getting entangled with the reality of the incarnation just right at that moment. But it's something, of course, that continued with Christ as Jesus lived throughout his days on earth.
Very cool. So I thought one of the most fascinating ideas in scientific ideas that you brought into this article was horizontal gene transfer. I'm not even going to attempt to give a summary of it. I will let you give a summary of it. But so both on the scientific level, can you describe to us a little bit more about this idea of horizontal gene transfer? And then also one of the theological implications that might be there for this idea that you mentioned in the article, you said, because of this, we might witness in the trees and soil and animals a remainder of Christ's body. So I wonder if you could unpack the science a little bit for us, and then also the theology that you mentioned in that quote of looking out our window and seeing these remainders of Christ's body.
Thanks. So I'll say first of all, I am not a professional scientist. So if I'm oversimplifying that for those who are, then forgive me. But the basics of horizontal gene transfer is that we've discovered that bacteria in particular do not have to go through the next generation to pass along genes. They can actually, as living organisms, swap genes with one another. And that's one of the things that makes them so challenging from a medical perspective when they are pathogenic, is that they can quickly become resistant to anything that's threatening them because they can just pass those genes for resistance around without even having to go to another generation. And so horizontal gene transfer is just, rather than the transfer of a parent to a child, they can just transfer, from as though it were, if I could transfer genes with my brother or something, that's the equivalent for a bacteria. Now, what scientists have begun to understand is that this can also happen with the cells of host animals. So a bacterium can be in my body and can also pick up genes from me. And at the same time, I can pick up genes from that bacterium. And so our genetics are beginning to be mixed and blended. And there's a lot of really interesting research being done on this at the moment. But as I wanted to think about this theologically, what what does that mean for us if in some way the bacteria that were part of Christ's body picked up some of the genetics of Christ and then brought those into conversation with the genes of other living creatures in the world? And there's this idea, and I think that Eastern Orthodox theology is really strong on this, of Christ coming into the world, transforming the world, and in some way, this trace of Christ being continually present on the earth. And so I wanted to think about how horizontal gene transfer could help us imagine this way in which Christ continues to be present with us even after Christ's ascension into heaven. And so that's where horizontal gene transfer can come into conversation with theology.
Yeah, and I just want to understand the science better because I love what you're sharing. Um, is part of this idea of looking out the window and seeing the remainder of Christ's body, does it have to do with the fact that his genes then are kind of carried via microbes to other organisms, and then they are still passing on their genes from one generation to the next. So you have all these creatures now influenced genetically by Christ's body during his time on Earth. But then as they go to their next generation, they're now passing on a genetic code that has in fact been altered by the microbes from Jesus, and that in some kind of somewhat mystical but somewhat scientific way, that influence is being carried on from generation to generation.
Yes, absolutely. So, and of course we can't identify the genes of Christ's body and see how those are playing out in nature. But what I want to get at is this amazing way in which we understand the incarnation, that there was something fundamental that changed not only about the human person, but also about the whole cosmos. And and I think we can see this in a kind of imaginative way with thinking about horizontal gene transfer. And I talk about in my article, I love this image from the Orthodox theologian Sergei Bulgakov, who he talks about the Holy Grail as this imaginative thing, that this idea of a cup that catches the blood and water that pours from Christ's side. And he says, well, the earth caught the blood and water that pours from Christ's side. So the earth becomes the Holy Grail and is forever transformed. So I want to kind of do the same thing, but not thinking about the Holy Grail, but thinking about horizontal gene transfer as a way that Christ becomes now entangled with the cosmos.
Oh, so great. Well, there's so many more things I'm sure we could talk about, but this has given us, I think, a lot to ponder. So thank you, Reagan. Anyone out there who did not catch this article, the link will be below in the video description. We will also include the link to Reagan's Substack, thewaywepractice.com. Thank you so much for being here today, Reagan. Great to chat with you.
Really appreciate it, John.